tonight on Nova. Chernobyl, the world's worst nuclear power plant accident. How did it happen?
There are fools who can overcome any foolproof system.
Could it happen again, or in the United States? We go to the Soviet Union for a behind-the-scenes look at the Chernobyl accident and its aftermath.
We're getting now quite a lot of activity. It's about 5 times the background.
5 times background, still safe for us.
Still safe. But I wouldn't want to have my children living here.
Join correspondent Bill Kurtis as he takes us on a journey back to Chernobyl.
At 1:23 in the morning of April 26, 1986, reactor number 4 at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant exploded. The first fireman on the scene found only a shell of the reactor building. At daylight, Soviet scientists searched for the source of the escaping radiation, the reactor fuel core. And deep in the debris, they confirmed their worst fears. It was on fire. The glowing graphite in the reactor core was burning at 5,000 degrees, slowly melting everything it touched, threatening to burn its way through the concrete floor toward the earth below. The siege of Chernobyl was unlike anything the Soviets had fought before. The danger was invisible. Workers could expose themselves to radiation for only a few minutes to clean up radioactive pieces of the core lying exposed to the air. Volunteer miners burrowed beneath the reactor to build a concrete barrier, racing against time. Outside the Soviet Union, the disaster would compound the world's doubts about nuclear power. A few countries would phase it out completely. I'm Bill Kurtis in the Soviet Union. A debate has evolved within the scientific community that some might have thought impossible when the first news of Chernobyl horrified the world. The views seem to be polarized around 2 questions. Will Chernobyl be remembered as the end of the peaceful use of nuclear energy, as the Hiroshima for our time? Or are we learning such valuable lessons from Chernobyl that nuclear power will take us into the 21st century? We're going to explore those questions with the world's leading experts and critics on nuclear power as we go back to Chernobyl. We went back to Chernobyl when the bitter Russian cold had turned the Ukraine white. In addition to our documentary crew and Soviet representatives, we were accompanied by Dr. Richard Wilson, professor of physics at Harvard University, an internationally recognized expert in nuclear power reactors, who had also made this trip a year earlier when the radiation levels were considerably higher.
Professor, how far do you think we are now from the reactor?
Oh, about 30 miles by now.
Should we check the readings?
Well, I'll just switch on the dosimeter. You'll hear high-pitched whistle as it tests the battery first. Now you can begin to hear a few clickings.
Yes.
And that's it's a fairly good background level, about the same as Kiev, and there's not very much. Let me just make sure it's really working. And I'll pull a source out of my case here.
And that level would seem to be the natural background.
That's the natural background, but now you can test the source of the beta ray source, and you hear it clicking away furiously.
Mm-hmm. Now, what reading do you expect to find around the reactor itself?
Around the reactor itself, I expect to find, on this scale, I'll find it'll be off scale, and I have to switch the next scale. It's about 30 times the background around the reactor itself.
You say off the scale, but will that be any danger to us?
No, it won't be any danger. Not for you could be there for a year, and you'd get the amount of radiation a worker is allowed to have in a year.
Winter in the Ukraine always leaves a desolate landscape, with scarcely a hint that this is the breadbasket of the Soviet Union. As we grew closer to the nuclear reactors, our dosimeters indicated a growing presence of radiation. The constant beeping was unnerving, but Professor Wilson assured us we were safe. We were listening to his most sensitive dosimeter.
We're about 40 kilometers from Chernobyl right now.
And we're about 20 minutes beyond our last point. And what's the reading?
The reading is about 1.5 times background, about 1.5 times what it was at Kiev. It drops in patches, sometimes a large amount in one area and sometimes nothing at all.
What would that be? Would it just be hanging in the air or reading in trees? Because we took that reading in when there were trees alongside.
That's very likely the trees. That's quite right, because the trees catch the radionuclides, the cesium which has been coming out, and it's very hard to clean them up, whereas the ordinary bare roadside can be cleaned up quite easily.
Even though there had been an extensive cleanup, there was no mistaking what had happened here. Our instruments recorded the invisible evidence of the events of April 26th, 1986. There were 2 explosions, the largest caused by a buildup of steam which blew the structure apart, releasing a huge plume of radioactive material into the air. Firemen were the first on the scene, and they paid the price of being exposed to extremely high levels of radiation. Of 31 fatalities, most were firemen. The first units were led by Major Leonid Telyatnikov, miraculously still alive.
When I arrived at the plant, I saw what had happened. There were flames on the roof of the reactor. The only thing they could tell me was that there was radiation. An explosion had occurred.
Major Telyatnikov has received the Medal of Hero of the Soviet Union, one of the country's highest honors. The other men who stood with him on the roof of the reactor died. After you knew the radiation was extremely high, why did you go ahead and fight the fire?
If we didn't, who would have put the fire out? Besides the firemen, no one was there.
This man in the mask was in charge of health facilities at a clinic near the plant. He's describing those first few hours for a Soviet television crew that went with him back to his clinic.
At roughly 2:40, the first injured persons came in. They were in very, very awful condition, in great shock, and they couldn't say what had happened or why. They didn't reply to any questions.
By morning, the 30 roof fires were out, but the reactor core burned on. Soviet scientists were not quite sure how it could be extinguished. They decided to smother the core in a blanket of 5,000 tons of sand, boron, and lead. A key scientific advisor was Vice President of the Soviet Academy of Sciences, Yevgeny Velikov. Was there a moment that you thought maybe you couldn't put out the fire?
No, I not was. When I am going to site, the fire was more or less in the finish. It's no. We have only after we have some ignition for 2 times, maybe 3 times, but it is not dangerous.
The fire was out, but the emergency continued. With the massive weight of material on top of the core, the entire building around the reactor threatened to collapse. There was only one solution. Miners were sent to tunnel beneath the reactor. Working 3-hour shifts, 400 men built a new concrete foundation. What they could do nothing about was the radiation that had already escaped. At 9 a.m. Monday, here in Sweden, scientists at a nuclear power plant discovered unusually high levels of radiation. But it was not until that evening that Moscow informed the world about the accident at Chernobyl.
oh, there's no doubt that the world could have been informed earlier and should have been informed earlier. The Soviets, of course, are reluctant to inform public of accidents until they understand them, because the one thing they fear more than anything is panic.
Valery Legasov of the Kurchatov Institute of Atomic Energy arrived on the day after the accident as a member of the government investigating committee.
The plant at the time didn't have systems to assess the scale of the accident consequences. This early information would have been erroneous, and it would have led to excess panic or excess optimism. That is why it was necessary to use 1.5 days to assess the situation and to inform the world.
The Soviets also drew criticism for the delay in telling their own people. 3 kilometers from the burning reactor was the town of Pripyat, the instant city built to house the workers of the power plant. The morning after the accident, there was no warning given. Children played outside as usual.
Well, I think they tried to hide the accident from us. That's really what I think. They could have told us to close the windows and not let the children go to school. That's what they should have done, but nobody did that or acted like that.
We have no preparation for early notification. It is necessary to be prepared, because all our intention was directed to the how to work with this problem.
Fortunately, the radiation levels near the plant were relatively low at first, because the explosion carried the radioactive material 2/3 of a mile straight up, well over the heads of the families in Pripyat. But 36 hours after the accident, when the levels of radiation continued to rise, an order was given to evacuate. 1,100 city buses from Kiev took only 3 hours to carry the people away. As the Soviet footage shows, the families left most of their possessions behind, as if they expected to come back soon. For years, they had been assured the plant was safe. In fact, just 2 months before, a Soviet official was quoted saying the odds of a meltdown at a nuclear plant were 1 in 10,000 years. And so when the residents of Pripyat were told to leave, it seemed to make little sense, as one Soviet reporter found.
It was difficult for them to understand. Why move when the flowers were still blooming outside? The corn was still growing. There was no fire, no flood. It wasn't an earthquake. It was some sort of unknown disaster.
In all, 135,000 people were eventually evacuated from a 30-kilometer zone surrounding the power plant. When we arrived in the evacuated village of Chernobyl, workers were using it as an important staging center for the cleanup operations. We transferred to a bus, which will never leave a special 10-kilometer zone around the reactor. Just one more precaution against the spread of radiation.
Now it's at least twice as high as when we were driving up 10 kilometers.
That's right.
Back.
It's about 5 times the background.
5 times background, still safe for us.
Still safe. But I wouldn't want to have my children living here.
Mm-hmm.
Just this area to the left. Just it looks like a field. This is the place where primarily forest was.
The trees had absorbed the radiation. They were cut down and buried in concrete-lined pits. And there it was. Reactor number 4, now a massive structure of metal and concrete. At this spot, shortly after the moment of explosion, the radiation reading was 3,000 rems per hour, 15,000 times greater than the normal exposure of most people in a year.
Now that's the sarcophagus to the left, isn't it? And so you've covered it.
At that level,
completely.
Radiation would have overwhelmed the nervous system of anyone this close and killed them within 20 to 60 minutes.
Reactor unit 5 on the 3 on the right. Not only the gases got out, but 3% of the solids of that reactor got out, which is a large fraction of a 2,000-ton device. And that was a spread everywhere downwind. So it would great big lumps of particulate matter were were settling all over the place. They had to physically clean that up. Now, the first thing they did was they, of course, tried to get robots, and then they found that the robots wouldn't work because they were built of transistors, and transistors don't like radiation, and so the robots crashed. So then they had to get volunteer soldiers to come in at 90 seconds apiece to shovel away the most dangerous parts and put them away.
It was one of the biggest peacetime undertakings the Soviets had ever experienced. 50,000 workers were rushed in, lured by offers of increased wages to work in areas where radiation was high. They prepared as if they were going to war. The danger was very real. All around them were radioactive substances like cesium-137, releasing invisible rays, nuclear particles like alpha, beta, and gamma rays, electromagnetic energy that are the most dangerous. Gamma rays can penetrate the body. In large doses, they all are capable of killing a person. In a lesser dose, they can trigger a cancer years after exposure. Nothing could be considered safe. 60,000 buildings had to be washed. A special solution was sprayed throughout the danger zone to keep radioactive dust from blowing and further contaminating the area. Anything that was exposed near the plant and could be moved was buried. Trucks, cars, and even the contaminated earth. Later, it would be charged that the cleanup all happened much too quickly, that the workers were unnecessarily exposed to high levels of radiation. The Soviets deny the charge, but no one denies the danger. A Ukrainian documentary which told the story of the cleanup described this as a place where danger became a way of life.
This is heroism. Without mercy for oneself. It's a real man's job, a real man's duty, to stand in the Chernobyl ranks.
The cameraman who made the documentary died within a year of the accident. The cause of death was reported to be radiation sickness. Nearly 3 years after the disaster, the cleanup continues without pause. The Soviets are aware that some of the radioactive material released from the reactor will last for years. Cesium-137, which concentrates in the muscle tissue, will be around for at least 30 years. In lesser quantities, strontium-90, which can damage bone tissue, will last for at least 28 years. The Soviets do not want to leave this radioactive material in the environment. The most dangerous concentration of the substances was in the reactor itself. Because the Soviet authorities still wanted to generate power from 3 other reactors at the complex, radioactive reactor number 4 had to be sealed off completely. An army of workers using 340,000 cubic meters of concrete and 3,000 tons of steel constructed a gigantic building over and around reactor number 4. It was 28 stories high, with a new roof, new walls on 4 sides, and a new concrete foundation. The sealed radioactive area became known as the sarcophagus, a tomb that is to last for centuries. Heavy shielding protected the other reactors and control rooms further down the building. And when it was finished, nuclear plant workers moved into reactor number 2 next door and put it back on the grid. Not long after, 2 other reactors were also turned on. It was a proud moment for the workers. Not only had they restored needed power, they felt they had won the invisible war against radiation.
In most areas you find around here, it's 100 times less than it was at the time of the accident.
In February last year, when Mr. Wilson was here, the radioactivity background at this very place was about 10 times as higher than it is now.
They wouldn't let me here.
20 times, 20 times as high.
What are the implications of the Chernobyl accident for nuclear power elsewhere? In the United States, experts pointed out that the design of the Chernobyl reactor was different from the design used in the U.S. All reactors operate on the principle of nuclear fission. When uranium fuel is brought together in sufficient mass, neutrons split the uranium atoms, causing the fuel to heat up. Water is pumped over the fuel. Some of it turns to steam and runs a turbine, which generates electricity. And some of it is recycled and returns to cool the core. Chernobyl number 4 was a Soviet-designed reactor called an RBMK. The uranium is contained in over 1,700 separate tubes, surrounded by blocks of graphite, which keep the chain reaction going. Control rods in the core regulate the reactor's power level. They are pulled out to increase power, put back in to decrease power. The rule, never to be broken, is that at least 30 control rods must be in the core at all times. U.S. reactors use a higher grade of uranium, which allows water instead of graphite to keep the reaction going. This difference is crucial, because if water is lost or boiled away, the nuclear reaction slows down by itself. In the RBMK, the opposite is true. When water boils away, the chain reaction speeds up because the graphite is still there. As more water is lost, the reactor heats up even more. Suddenly, the reactor is out of control in an escalating spiral.
Nothing can be controlled if the power doubles in a fraction of a second. That just is impossible. So the reactor was very badly designed. We never had such a reactor. We never would have permitted such a reactor.
But U.S.-designed reactors have also had problems. In 1979, the worst nuclear accident in U.S. history occurred at 3 Mile Island. In that case, operator error and equipment failure caused coolant water to drop. The chain reaction slowed, but the core was so hot that eventually it threatened to burn through the reactor in what is known as a meltdown. Like Chernobyl, there was great confusion. 2 days passed before Pennsylvania's governor advised children and pregnant women to leave the area. Many did. But unlike Chernobyl, there was no runaway chain reaction, no explosion of radioactive material or immediate deaths. One reason was that the reactor was protected by a containment dome, which held all but a small amount of radioactive gases under cover.
The amount of radioactivity which was released in 3 Mile Island was totally negligible. But from Chernobyl, 1 million times more radioactivity was released.
At Chernobyl, there was no full Western-style containment dome, only a building that housed the 4 reactors and administrative offices.
The Western reactor experts told the Soviet designers for years and years, you have to have a containment building. Oh, the Russians said, we don't need that, our reactors are safe.
One thing 3 Mile Island did have in common with Chernobyl is the element of human error, and that's why some people warn of future accidents.
Well, we've already had all of the ingredients of a disaster. We've had drug use in plants. We've had control room operators asleep at the switch. We've had people tying open vital valves with rope. If you look at the federal government studies from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, there's basically an unlimited possibility for ways in which a major accident can occur.
That there are fools who can overcome any foolproof system. I mean, we've shown, that's been shown, and therefore I hope the next generation of reactors will be yet more inherently safe.
The danger to me is coming not from the technological even side, from the psychological, from the human nature, the operator mistake.
At the far end of the long building, we found the office of the plant director, Mikhail Yumanets. This was the command post during the nuclear emergency, but the mood of desperation has changed considerably.
I would like to bring you a present, and here are 3 pictures of your power plant taken from our satellites at the time, about the time of your accident.
Я хочу сделать вам подарок. Это фотографии вашей станции, сделанные со спутника.
And the color is the temperature. So,
цвет показывает температуру.
So this one is taken before the accident, and you see the hot water coming out.
Это снимок, сделанный до аварии, и вы можете здесь видеть, как выходит вода пресная.
Спасибо.
Thank you very much.
Another thing, we thought that I thought after your hard work at at getting the reactor operating, you'll need a vacation, and you need something to wear on a vacation. So I thought I'd bring you something from America, which is, and here you can see what it says.
Которую вы делали, я подумал, что вам пригодится этот мой подарок. Посмотрите, что там написано. Написано nuclear energy safer than sex. Ядерная энергетика более безопасна, чем секс.
The director can enjoy his laugh because the emergency is clearly over, but far from forgotten.
I think that Chernobyl will remain in memory of people, just like a place where a very good and important experience had been, but at a very high price.
We asked Director Jumanits if he would take us to a control room similar to one where the accident took place. After putting on some protective clothing, we walked down a corridor which links all three working reactors. It's identical to the control room of Reactor 4, a reactor which had one of the best safety records in the Soviet Union at the time of the accident. The Soviet explanation of what happened begins at 1 a.m., the morning of April 25th. Unit 4 is scheduled to be shut down for maintenance. The operators have planned to run a special test to see how long the turbines will continue to run the emergency cooling systems if power is interrupted by an accident. According to plan, the staff begins to drop the power from its normal 3,200 megawatts to get ready for the test. Over the next 24 hours, they will deliberately switch off all the emergency systems which would interfere with the test. As the power moves toward 1,600 megawatts, the operators make a simple but fateful error, setting a regulator improperly. The power crashes to 30 megawatts. The reactor was becoming hard to control. It should have been shut down, but the testing would have been spoiled, so the staff makes the decision to continue. By 1 a.m., April 26th, the staff tries to increase power in the reactor by raising the control rods. Power does go up to 200 megawatts, but at the cost of raising all but 6 of the 30 required control rods. It was the biggest mistake they made. They lost control of the reactor. There was one last safety system in place which would have shut the reactor down, but the operators blocked the signal. At 1:23, with the control rods out and safety systems disconnected, the operators begin the experiment, cutting off the steam supply to the generator. As coolant water begins to decrease, the power level begins to rise. 36 seconds later, the shift supervisor tries to drop all the control rods back into the core, but it's too late. In 4.5 seconds, the power level of the reactor rises to 120 times its capacity. According to witnesses outside unit number 4, there were 2 explosions. Hot sparks and pieces of the core flew out of the building.
That bang, it roared like thunder in the distance. I asked, what was it? They said, well, aren't you used to that? It's a steam discharge from the power plant.
The Russians, as you know, in that reactor had some half a dozen cardinal rules that the operator shouldn't do. And in the one accident, he managed to violate at least 5 of the 6 rules. And they were all important rules, like don't take all the control rods out, and don't operate the plant below 30% power because it gets unstable. They did both of those things.
So the operation was simply irresponsible. And the combination of bad design and irresponsible and ignorant operation just made this disaster which has no equal.
Later, it would be said that the operators of reactor number 4 suffered from overconfidence, rooted in their belief that nuclear power was absolutely safe, a feeling often cultivated by governments committed to nuclear energy. Dr. Boloded remembers not even running safety drills because they didn't want to scare people.
And I tell you that we had an instructions on a paper from the IAEA where was written what to do in the case of nuclear accident. Everything is in a book, very thin book. The instructions, you know, that instructions. You perhaps took part in the analyzing that. But anyway, it was forgotten because there was no drill. Is it, you call it drill? Yes, drill for such things. Why? Very simple. Not to scare people. It takes a lot of efforts. And the question was that why we should do so if the atomic energy is a safe energy.
Before we left the reactor building, we took 2 final readings on our dosimeter. One in the director's office, clearly inside the building. As we moved the meter toward the window, the reading increased dramatically.
Now you're almost going off the scale.
It's about 20 or 30 times background now.
And that's just a result of...
That's radiation coming in from outside.
Coming in through the window from outside.
When there's a danger of radiation, it's clearly safer to stay inside. The second reading came after using the special radiation detectors, which every worker must pass through, both arriving for and leaving work.
First reading, and it's pegged on that mark far beyond the background level, far beyond. We're 20, 30 times. Let's move it to a higher level. And it's still pegged. Now I'm going to move it to the highest level. We're outside by the parking lot, and it backs off.
That's right.
Now
that is still a very high level. It's about 5 milligrams per hour. Now one has that. That's a very high level, and that's radioactivity on this concrete here. And you put one's hand over it, it goes down a little bit, because that is the difference between the beta rays, which are not penetrating, and the gamma rays, which are.
Now that suggests to me that's dangerous.
Well, not really, because you can see this is just surface. It hardly penetrates the hand, so it won't penetrate the clothes either, you see. So most of that radiation is very much from the surface there.
And we are protected by the clothes.
So a better reading is when you put your hand over it, and then it's a lot better.
So we're not talking about radioactivity just being in the air without something to carry it.
That's right.
Dust and particles have to attach to it.
There's dust and particles, and in particular it's on the ground, and the stuff that's deep in the concrete you don't mind about, because that is shielded by the concrete. It's the stuff which is on the surface which is the trouble.
Now, just inside, we saw automatic machines where the workers would immediately be registered or measured.
Yeah, and that's making sure they've got no radioactivity on their hands, because if you've been cleaning up very high levels, you can get it on your hands, and then you might suck your fingers and it goes inside. And that's where you really don't want the radioactivity, inside the body, because then the radiation from that is bound to be hit by the body somehow.
But our small beeps, widely distant earlier, are now into a steady sound, which is a little unnerving.
That's right. But I bought the most sensitive meter I could find.
Oh, well, that
and so that this was, in fact, the meter I bought last time and has been used already for the cleanup of Unit 3. That could read 100 times higher than this one.
Oh.
But I bought a more sensitive one because I knew we were going to be looking near the background.
Well, it still would indicate that suggest I don't exactly want to stand around this place.
No, but we shouldn't stay here all day.
Why don't we move to the bus and I'll carry this?
Some argue that Chernobyl could have been worse.
If it had been raining at the time of the accident, if the wind had been blowing towards the big city, Kiev, with 2.5 million people, and if that rain had fallen in Kiev, you would have had a very serious situation. You may have had acute casualties even in Kiev, and the numbers, instead of the number of people who got radiation sick, instead of being a few hundred, would have been in the thousands and the 10,000s. So in that sense, the accident was not the worst that we could have had.
As it was, 237 people were diagnosed with acute radiation sickness. One of them was the firefighter Telyatnikov, who was treated for 2 months at a Moscow hospital. He now considers himself recovered and does not comment about the long-term effects of his exposure. Valery Legasov of the Government Investigating Committee was also exposed to high levels of radiation. But he was always confident, even joking with other workers that there was no danger. On the second anniversary of the accident, Valery Legasov committed suicide. There was speculation that his death was related to Chernobyl. Was his death connected at all with his exposure to radiation?
No. It's pure psychological problem.
Personal, psychological, and personal family, perhaps?
It's difficult to say, but yes, I think so.
As for the individuals who lived nearby the plant, thousands were examined in hospitals and clinics in Kiev. Most were released. But the sight of people flocking to hospitals is blamed for the reports of mass deaths in the Western media. A maternity center for pregnant women from Pripyat was opened in a former cardiological hospital in Kiev. There was fear the radiation would affect the developing fetus.
When the accident took place, my neighbor came in and said, "They're going to evacuate." And I said, "Why?" She said, "We've got to leave. There's been a great accident. You're pregnant. You've got to go."
Dr. Elena Lukhanova was placed in charge of monitoring the births of women who lived in Pripyat. So far, there have been no problems reported.
1,950 babies were born after the accident to pregnant women in the zone. All are as healthy as 600 born before the accident.
But she is looking closely for possible cases of childhood leukemia that could develop during the first 4 to 6 years of life. So the first health reports from Chernobyl are in, but no one believes that is where the impact of the accident will end. When the plume of radioactive material rose on the night of April 26th, the winds carried it to the northwest, into Latvia, Lithuania, northern Poland, and across the Baltic Sea into Scandinavia. On the second day, the winds changed, blowing to the west and southwest, passing over southern Poland, Austria, southern Germany, Switzerland, Italy, and France. On the fifth day, another wind change, back to the northwest, and the cloud moved into central Germany, the Netherlands, and Great Britain. Eventually, the winds blew northeast, spreading the fallout into central Russia. Some radioactive material rode the jet stream over the United States and other countries. In all, more than 20 countries received fallout from Chernobyl, and countermeasures varied. In some countries, milk and fresh vegetables were banned. In other countries, like Poland, potassium iodide was distributed to children to protect against thyroid cancer. Hardest hit were the Lapp people of northern Sweden. The reindeer herds they depend on for their livelihood were found to be so contaminated by radiation they were unfit for human consumption. Across Europe, the amount of contamination depended on whether it was raining at the time the cloud passed over.
I was on a sabbatical in the small town of Konstanz in southern Germany on the Swiss border, and I went there to do some physics research with some colleagues. Then on Wednesday it rained all day. I remembered that rain brings down radioactivity from the nuclear weapons tests in Nevada. So I thought, well, maybe we can measure something after all, even though we decided we couldn't measure anything. And I was very surprised, because what we found was that the radiation level outside the building was about 40 times the radiation level inside the building. And this was a staggering fact to me, that it could be that high. By morning, we had a spectrum which told us just about everything we wanted to know about that reactor, because we were finding on the ground in Konstanz, Germany, the entire core contents of the reactor. All the different isotopes, the radionuclides that you expect inside the reactor, were lying on the ground in Germany.
Nearly 400 million people were exposed to Chernobyl's fallout, and the effects are still fiercely debated. The controversy is focused around one question: how many cases of cancer can be expected as a result of the accident?
The number of cases in the West, that is outside the Soviet Union, will be maybe 2,000.
One can make an estimate, and it's a pretty good estimate, that about 20,000 people throughout the whole world in their whole lives will get cancer from this cause.
From my perspective, we're not talking about 31 acute fatalities. We're talking about whether or not we're going to see 250,000, 500,000 cancers appearing in the population as a result of this accident.
Estimates range from 0 to over 500,000. One reason for the debate is that no one is certain how dangerous low levels of radiation are. Some of the information we do have centers around studies of what happened here. The survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki have been studied since their exposure in 1945 to the high levels of radiation from 2 atomic bombs. Those who survived the initial explosion were hit with large doses of radiation which penetrated the body and destroyed its cells. Those closest died within minutes. Others exposed to lower levels of radiation died within months, as radiation damaged rapidly dividing cells in vital organs like blood-producing bone marrow. Those still further away, exposed to even lower levels of radiation, showed no immediate health effects. But how does exposure to low levels of radiation affect an individual's chance of getting cancer? For the people exposed to radiation from Chernobyl, it's a difficult question to answer.
The first one is what doses did people really get? There are a lot of uncertainties there. You know, not everybody had a dosimeter, not everybody had, there weren't measurements on what everybody ate.
Complicating the question is the fact that many of those exposed will get cancer from other sources.
It'll be very difficult to determine how many of the cancers actually were from Chernobyl as from other effects in the population. So we may never know what the actual level of risks from this accident will be.
Chernobyl may lead to a greater understanding of the effects of low-level radiation if the Soviets successfully carry out their plans to conduct lifelong studies of the 135,000 people evacuated after the accident. The human costs of Chernobyl will be debated well into the next century. But as we walked through the streets of Kiev, it was easy to see that already, in many ways, life had returned to normal here. The city of 2.5 million goes about its business as usual. In the days after the accident, fleets of water trucks washed the city's streets day and night. But today, the streets are considered clean and safe once again. Street vendors are again allowed. Apples can be sold on a corner, no longer requiring a radiation check. The leaves were buried, not burned this year, but now the trees stand ready for a new spring. 3 years ago, the most dramatic effect of Chernobyl here was that tens of thousands of children were sent away to avoid harm from radiation. Now, the children are home. But for some people, doubts and fears linger. They are uncertain about their future. Plans to have children are postponed. They ascribe all kinds of illnesses to their radiation exposure. And there are even occasional rumors, as there were after the accident, that thousands of victims were secretly buried. But officials deny the rumors and maintain that there is no danger. They point out that food markets are no longer subject to restrictions. Warnings of contaminated milk and vegetables have been lifted. The outward appearance is that the danger is gone. Still, Chernobyl has left its mark. After the accident, immediate changes were made in the Soviet nuclear policy. Specific changes were made in response to specific lessons.
The primary lesson is one that a number of experts have been saying for 30 years, that you can't depend on just one thing in safety. They were depending on careful operation and rigid adherence to rules to overcome an instability in their reactor design.
All 15 of the Soviets' RBMK reactors were shut down and retrofitted. Changes were made to decrease the time it takes to put the control rods back into the reactor core. The minimum number of control rods to be kept in the core was raised from 30 to 80. No more RBMK reactors will be started. although several under construction will be completed. Also, changes were made in the training of staff and in the management hierarchy.
We changed the status of the personnel. We changed completely the schedule because before Chernobyl, sometimes we hire personnel only in a few months before completion of the station. Today, it's long time before.
One lesson of Chernobyl is that the people who operate the reactor must be well informed, and that there must be regulations, and the regulations have to be obeyed. In Russia, that is very often not the case, because if you obeyed all regulations in Russia, you couldn't live.
From a simply human point of view, Chernobyl shows what can result when someone does not do their job properly, when people don't take the responsibilities seriously and fully.
The seriousness of the human error was driven home with a trial of the men responsible for running the plant. 6 were found guilty of gross violations of safety regulations and sentenced to Soviet labor camps. The changes in nuclear policy were the first, most obvious response to Chernobyl. But for the Russian people, there was a different lesson. Chernobyl taught them that nuclear energy cannot come with guarantees that it is 100% safe. With the new policy of glasnost, of openness in the Soviet Union, questions about safety have turned into a vocal opposition to nuclear power. The new uncertainty and fear was illustrated in a Soviet documentary on Chernobyl called Warning.
The bells of Chernobyl are ringing out over fresh graves as a new warning to us of a fearsome, unseen, unheard danger. A danger without color, without flavor. How can you hide from it? How can you protect yourself and your children when it can threaten you from everywhere? It accumulates in the leaves. It can appear in milk, in water. It can be here. Is it dangerous or not?
While the cleanup at Chernobyl has allowed the 3 undamaged reactors to reopen there, planning and construction have been stopped in at least 5 other sites, the result of public protests.
We have very heavy debate, very hot debates, public debates today, and it's cost us, I think, 5 years delay in fission development program.
Did you stop construction because of an anti-nuclear protest or a fear among the people in the area?
It's complicated, you know this, the Western experience is the protest. This protest, of course, is expression of the feeling of different group, especially the groups who have no previous voice. Today they maybe in some way use this. It's natural.
In other countries, too, people saw Chernobyl as a reason to re-examine nuclear power. Sweden reaffirmed its decision to phase out its nuclear plants by the year 2010. Greece, Yugoslavia, Austria, the Philippines, and the Netherlands canceled or postponed plans for new reactors. But countries like France, Belgium, Great Britain, and Japan remain committed to nuclear power. And in the United States, some argue that even before Chernobyl, nuclear power was virtually on its way out.
In this country, Chernobyl is, I think, is another nail in the coffin of nuclear power. There haven't been any orders for new nuclear plants since the mid-1970s, and I don't anticipate any new orders for a decade or two at the earliest, and perhaps none ever.
But others see reasons to revive nuclear energy. Unrelated to Chernobyl, there is a new concern about the greenhouse effect, the warming of the Earth, caused largely by the burning of coal and oil to produce electricity. Nuclear energy does not contribute to the greenhouse effect. In the long run, Chernobyl could help the nuclear power industry by improving safety and bringing about more effective regulations. Some supporters have found another positive lesson.
When we realized that that kind of accident produced modest but not catastrophic results that some had imagined, it may well be a net positive benefit in the long run.
The main thing about Chernobyl is that we probably have seen the worst. And having seen the worst is a good start from doing better. We must never see Chernobyl again.
As we found in our journey back to Chernobyl, it is the lesson the Soviets believe as well. Though they did have good luck in terms of the weather on the night of the accident, they maintain that the explosion at Chernobyl was as bad as anyone had ever predicted. And yet, they have survived.
It was the worst nuclear accident, and we survived. We are sitting here, we are drinking coffee.
Чернобыль не только не отвратит людей от атомной энергии, но и докажет то, что человек властен над этой энергией.
I think that Chernobyl will not divert people from atomic energy, but it will prove that man has a power to cope with it.
И в этом смысле жертвы Чернобыля, хотя бы, скажем, и случайные, но не бесполезны.
And in this sense, the Chernobyl casualties, though being very great, they are not useless. And if I could not believe in this, I would not stay here.
Have the protests changed the Soviets' commitment to nuclear power?
No, it's not prevented. It just delay our plan because we have very ambitious plan to build more and more nuclear reactors. And this delay just to change the derivative. It's not prevented. We're going up.
They are pressing ahead, they say, with a healthy respect for the risks of nuclear energy and an appreciation for the need for safety.
I think we make mistake in previous years, and choosing a site was too simplified and not have enough solid basis.
Prior to Chernobyl, everybody just thought that nuclear power was absolutely safe and perhaps took it for granted.
Yes, this was a mistake of technical community. And another question was, it was big pressure from Department of Energy to put more and more power station. But in any case, I think some part of development is quite healthy because we pay more attention to the seismic condition, to the soil condition, to the problem of the waterbed, problem of reactor construction, all together.
If there is ever a need to be reminded of the potential danger of a nuclear accident, the town of Pripyat stands as the most dramatic symbol. The families which left Pripyat with little warning that Sunday, April 27th, have not returned. New housing was found for all of them. A few of the cleanup workers from Chernobyl do stay in some of the apartments, and authorities here even suggest it might be safe enough to let families return someday.
I think it'll be longer than they're estimating, because unless they do a lot of work on actual cleanup and scraping, and more scraping, this will only be down factor 2 in about 5 or 10 years. And so it'll be, say, 5 years before they could do very much more.
Well, we keep getting readings there, but it's safe as long as you don't stay too long.
That's right. It's and the people who are living here during their shifts, they're all right because they're living in the cleaner part of the town.
Must have been a massive effort to scrape away the dirt.
Yes, indeed, and of course it's still going on in other parts, other areas.
It's clean, a spooky feeling, isn't it? Is this the future?
I hope not.
Or a symbol that perhaps we can learn. We can just learn.
Yes, I've been in deserted places before, but it's not quite as large an area as this.